So thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I'm going to come at this from a very different perspective. I don't have one of these fabulous examples to share with you in terms of a sustainable build. Instead, what I wanted to do was kind of take us on a bit of a thought journey about how, as a nation, we support this move towards net zero, because I think there are some interesting conflicts in the way that we're all individually approaching this challenge. And I want to start by saying I'm incredibly inspired by the 3 stories that we've heard today, and I think they're great examples of how we might move forward. So question number 1. Oh, I don't seem to be able to control my screen. There we go. Question number 1, and I'm sure everyone on this call is very well aware of Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, what do they mean? But I want to start here because I think it's important for the conversation. So in terms of how we track our emissions as a nation, typically what we do is we focus on our Scope 1. So everything that we're directly responsible for, those are the things that we can directly control, and those are the ways that we as individuals, as businesses, can help contribute towards net zero. I know there are a lot of really fantastic conversations around how we then incorporate Scope 2 into our own personal accountability. But where we don't necessarily see a lot of personal or business accountability is in those Scope 3 emissions. And why is that a problem? Well, I think that actually Richard just really beautifully touched on that. The problem is because, where the carbon sits in the supply chain is a little bit unbalanced. And Richard, I liked your slide there. I've come up with one of my own. And this is an absolute Clare creation. There's no science that's gone behind this, but I just wanted to generally convey the sense of where the problem is for the concrete supply chain. So if you think about carbon intensity in our built environment and the life cycle of that concrete asset, all of that kind of carbon intensity, all of the carbon production really sits right over here on the supply side of the concrete life cycle. So when you're thinking about the way that we manage carbon as a nation and the way that we're potentially going to meet some of our targets against the Paris Agreement, and thinking about the fact that that's generally thought of from a Scope 1 perspective, that means that the businesses that are responsible for the carbon intensity in our built environment are the suppliers. So the concrete suppliers, the steel suppliers, the aluminium suppliers, all the people that contribute the supply side, they're the ones that bear the cost, the responsibility, the accountability for those carbon emissions. So we have to have a think about how we deal with that as a nation. So I wanted to call out the way that this is kind of happening from the conversations that I've seen, and absolutely noting Hudson's comment at the start about this being a pre-competitive space. I'm actually going to focus this conversation on personal accountability rather than business accountability, because there are some great examples of this from a business perspective. But when I started popping them all up on the screen, I thought, oh, I might not actually call anyone out directly for the way that we're managing this. So let's instead think about us as individuals. There are some incredible calculators available for us as participants in the economy to think about what our own personal carbon footprint is. I've just pulled this one, which is the Nature Conservancy. It's a freely available tool that you can go to their website and then basically just plonk in a lot of numbers about how you live your life. And it comes up with a metric for you in terms of your own annual carbon footprint, and then some actions that you can take as well towards reducing that. And so what I wanted to note here is that in so many of these conversations, when we think about our kind of embodied carbon in the products that we use, we might be thinking about transportation, we might be thinking about, the fact that we're buying a new TV, for example, but typically the actual building, the infrastructure, the concrete infrastructure that we're using is kind of forgotten in that conversation. So here in the Nature Conservancy calculator, for example, you can see this is the Home tab. It's not actually asking me about the use of this space that I'm sitting in right now. So this apartment, I'm working from home today. I've lived here for 5 years now. If we think about the fact that this apartment might have a life cycle of 100 years, I personally, in my thinking about my use of this apartment, am not making myself 5% responsible for the carbon that went into building this apartment. And yet, really, if you think about it, my use of this building should be my responsibility. So I wanted to turn that to how we talk about this on a national platform. And I know that there are some fabulously qualified people on the call. I can see Jason Nunn from CCAA, for example, who are probably much better qualified to talk about this than I am. But I think this is a really important discussion for us to have. So Australia's commitments to the Paris Agreement were recently updated. I'm sure everyone's well aware of that. So this is the new Australian National Determined Contribution. So our commitment towards that Paris Agreement. I think you're all aware that the new targets are that we're 43% below our 2005 emissions by 2030. So that's pretty ambitious. So if we look at the structure of the program that's been proposed by the current federal government, there's kind of two interesting categories that we could look at in terms of the programs. So number one, which I'll highlight here, is our investment in new technologies, new infrastructure, which is going to be able to help us to reduce our carbon overall. So you can see here we've got up the top there, the new renewable infrastructure, $3 billion to create more renewable capacity, which is fantastic. We've got a rollout of an EV scheme to help people to pick up electric vehicles. So this is really our investment in new renewable, new sustainable tools and products to help us move forward. On the other side of that, we have this one, which is we're going to lower the baseline on the safeguard mechanism. So the safeguard mechanism essentially creates a requirement for any high emitting business over a certain threshold to buy ACCUs or carbon credits to offset their emissions above a certain level. And so what we're going to do is bring down that level, which means that you're going to be responsible to pay for more ACCUs to offset more of that carbon intensity. So again, when we're thinking about who bears that risk, it's really the supply side that's going to bear that risk. And the challenge here that I just wanted to point out quickly is if you look at these two things together, on the one hand, the ones that I've highlighted, they're green, we're talking about buying significant new concrete, cement, steel, aluminium infrastructure in new hydro plants, new wind turbines. That's significant investment in concrete infrastructure. And on the other hand, we're talking about penalising the suppliers of those products. So we just have to think really about how we bring those two things together. So just very quickly, and again, you're probably all aware of this, the way that the safeguard mechanism is managed is we look at carbon listed under the national inventory, so you can access that very easily. And again, I just wanted to point out that this is very scope 1 focused, so it's just about direct emissions. So I guess the big thing there to note is what we have now is not going to get us where we need to go. We need to think very innovatively about how we achieve our net zero targets collectively, how we collaborate, and how we give ourselves that scope 3 accountability. There are some great examples that we're seeing already of companies that are building carbon into their balance sheets, that are thinking about that full life cycle embodied carbon conversation. And I think they should be really celebrated. But consistently, we need to think about how do we collectively find those innovative ways to collaborate and work together. And so in some ways, that's why we exist. So SmartCrete is a cooperative research centre, and we're here to look at problem sets that we can work collectively on to drive the sector forward. And fundamentally, the research programs that we're looking at are all about how do we build sustainability into Australia's cement and concrete sector. So we have 3 research programs. And really these 3 research programs all look at a different component in terms of that sustainability journey. So you've got the first one here, which is sustainability, looking at different concrete mixes. We've heard a lot today about the idea of replacing cements. And in fact, the concrete sector has had decade-long engagement in that conversation with the use of supplementary cementitious materials. But now, I think I saw a comment in the chat before about geopolymers. We're thinking, how do we potentially replace even those supplementary cementitious materials that we currently use as those become depleting reserves, as we start to move away from aluminium and steel smelting and coal-fired power plants, for example, which create a lot of those industrial byproducts. We're going to need to find alternatives. Engineered solutions, which we've heard some really great examples of those today, different ways of thinking about how we use these high carbon products to reduce the amount of concrete that we need overall. And then finally, asset management, because if we're thinking life cycle embodied carbon, really asset management and increasing the longevity of our existing concrete infrastructure is a huge part of how we meet that journey. So I wanted to very quickly, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm trying to talk a mile a minute, but very quickly touch on 2 projects that we're working on right now. So the first one is a project where we're really, again, thinking about those innovative new concrete mixes and how we can potentially build that concept of waste cycling into our conversation about sustainable concrete. So this is a project that we have been running with Paintback. So Paintback are an industry body which manages waste paint. So I'm sure everyone has about 10 different paint buckets out in their garage or in their shed outside with that tiny little bit of paint at the bottom, and you don't know what to do with it because you have to take it to the waste transfer station, and it's a whole thing. Paintback will take that for you. So they collect millions of tons of waste paint per year, and they look for opportunities to recycle that into different products. So one of the big things that they do with it is they look at transforming it into a kind of biogas energy production supply side. But the other thing we're doing is we're saying, how could that paint potentially be cured, be treated, and then take out some really valuable material from that paint to act as an additive in concrete. I could spend hours on these, so I won't. I'll just go really fast. Another one on the asset management side is thinking about how we extend the life cycle of some of our concrete infrastructure like sewer systems. So in Sydney, some of our sewer infrastructure can be up to 100 years old. It's critical infrastructure for the city. I mean, we certainly wouldn't want to see our sewer system break down here. That would be pretty catastrophic. But really, we have to think cleverly about how we understand the health of our sewer environment when we actually can't see it on a day-to-day basis. And sending people down to do those inspections is not only very costly, it's quite dangerous. So we're working with Macquarie University, Sydney Water and Melbourne Water to create some pretty innovative photonic sensing, which essentially sits like a little bit of a concrete canary in the sewer system, helping us to understand the degradation rates of those sewer pipes. So we can do much more prescriptive based maintenance and rehabilitation of concrete pipes as opposed to, you know, a program-based approach. I think that might be my last slide. Let me just double check. Yeah, if you want to know more about what we're doing, please come and visit us at SmartCrete CRC. But we're really excited to be part of this conversation. And I also just want to recognise it's so wonderful that the entire supply chain is so engaged in this conversation now. Net zero is obviously something we're all very passionate about, which I think we probably couldn't have said 10 years ago. So really great to acknowledge that we're all working together.